Have you ever looked into the eyes of someone who wants you dead? I have. And let me tell you something that still sends shivers down my spine every single time I close my eyes. The moment you realize that the person you loved, the person you trusted with every fiber of your being, has decided that you no longer deserve to breathe. That's when everything you thought you knew about life shatters into a million irreparable pieces. My name doesn't matter right now. What matters is that I'm here, alive, breathing, telling you this story that I swore I would never share with anyone. But here I am, because silence almost killed me once, and I refuse to let it claim anyone else. This isn't just my story. This is a story about survival, about finding strength in the darkest corners of your soul when everything around you is screaming that you should just give up. It's about that moment when you have to choose between existing or truly living, between being a victim or becoming a survivor. And I chose to survive. I chose to live to tell. That day, March 15th, started like any other day in what had become my personal hell. The sun was shining outside, birds were singing, neighbors were going about their normal lives, completely unaware that just a few feet away, behind closed doors and drawn curtains, someone was planning my murder. Isn't it terrifying how normal everything can seem on the surface while underneath, darkness is consuming everything you are? I woke up that morning with a knot in my stomach, that familiar sensation that had become my constant companion over the past 2 years. You know that feeling when you know something bad is about to happen, but you can't quite put your finger on what it is? That's how I lived every single day. Walking on eggshells, measuring every word, calculating every movement, trying desperately to predict which version of him I would encounter when he walked through that door. Would it be the charming man I fell in love with? Or would it be the monster who had slowly replaced him? I remember standing in front of the mirror that morning, looking at my reflection and barely recognizing the woman staring back at me. Where had I gone? When did I disappear? My eyes, once bright and full of dreams and ambitions, had become hollow, empty vessels that reflected nothing but fear and exhaustion. The bruises on my arms were fading to that yellowish-green color, the ones from last week's episode, as I had learned to call them in my mind, because somehow giving them a clinical name made them feel less real, less devastating. I had become an expert at covering up. Not just the physical marks, those were easy with the right makeup and carefully chosen clothing, but the emotional scars, the psychological wounds that ran so deep, I wasn't sure they would ever heal. I smiled when I was supposed to smile. I laughed when laughter was expected. I played the role of the perfect girlfriend so convincingly that even I sometimes forgot I was acting. But that morning, something felt different. There was a heaviness in the air, an electricity that made every hair on my body stand on end. I could feel it in my bones, that primal instinct that warns you when danger is near. Animals have it, that sixth sense that tells them to run before the predator strikes. Somehow, despite everything he had done to break me, despite all his efforts to destroy my spirit and crush my will to fight, that instinct had survived inside me. It was screaming at me that morning, telling me that today would be different, that today everything would change. I just didn't know how right it would be. As I moved through the apartment, I noticed every detail with an almost supernatural clarity. The crack in the kitchen tile that I had stared at countless times while waiting for his rage to pass. The smell of coffee that once meant comfort and warmth, but now just reminded me of all the mornings I had tried to be perfect enough, quiet enough, invisible enough to avoid triggering his anger. The sound of traffic outside, people going to work, living their lives, existing in a world that felt so far removed from mine that they might as well have been on another planet. I thought about calling in sick to work, but I knew that would only make things worse. He monitored everything, my phone calls, my text messages, my emails, even my thoughts if he could have found a way to do it. Any deviation from routine was met with interrogation, accusations, and eventually, violence. So I got ready for work like I always did, moving through the motions like a robot programmed to perform specific tasks. But my mind was racing, playing out scenarios, preparing for something I couldn't quite name but knew was coming. Have you ever felt like you're living in a nightmare, but you can't wake up no matter how hard you try? That's what my life had become. Every day was a carefully choreographed dance with disaster, and I was exhausted from trying to predict the steps, from trying to stay one beat ahead of the violence that I knew was always lurking just beneath the surface of his carefully controlled facade. People always ask survivors why they didn't just leave, as if it's that simple, as if walking out the door is just a matter of putting one foot in front of the other. But they don't understand the invisible chains that bind you to your abuser. They're made of fear, yes, but also of manipulation, of psychological warfare so sophisticated that by the time you realize you're trapped, you've forgotten what freedom even feels like. He had isolated me so completely that I had no one to turn to. My family? He had convinced me they didn't really love me, that they only pretended to care. My friends? One by one, they had disappeared from my life, driven away by his jealousy, his possessiveness, his ability to make every social interaction so uncomfortable and tense that eventually people just stopped calling. My job? It was the only thing I had left, the only place where I could pretend to be normal for a few hours. But even that was under his control. He drove me to work every morning and picked me up every evening, timing it perfectly so I had no opportunity to talk to anyone, no chance to ask for help, no moment to breathe without his surveillance. I had become a prisoner in my own life, and the worst part was that I had walked into this prison willingly, thinking it was love. That's what makes intimate partner violence so insidious. It doesn't announce itself with sirens and warning signs. It creeps in slowly, disguised as concern, as protection, as devotion. By the time you realize you're in danger, you're so deeply entangled in the web of abuse that escape seems impossible. And the shame, God, the shame is almost worse than the physical pain. How could I, an educated woman with a good job and a supportive family, end up in this situation? How could I let someone treat me this way? These questions haunted me constantly, eating away at what little self-worth I had left. But here's what I learned. What I wish I could go back and tell that terrified woman standing in front of the mirror that morning. It wasn't my fault. None of it was my fault. Not his anger, not his violence, not his decision to hurt me. I didn't cause it and I couldn't control it. The only thing I could control was my decision to survive. And on that day, March 15th, that's exactly what I did. The story of how I ended up in that apartment, in that relationship with that man, begins almost 3 years before that terrible day. I met him at a coffee shop, of all places. It sounds so cliché now, so stereotypically romantic in that movie script kind of way. I was sitting alone, reading a book, enjoying a rare moment of solitude on a Saturday afternoon. He approached my table with a smile that could light up a room, holding a cup of coffee and asking if he could join me because all the other tables were taken. It was a lie, of course. I could see empty tables scattered throughout the cafe, but I didn't know that then. I just saw a handsome, charming man who seemed genuinely interested in the book I was reading. We talked for hours that day, about literature and philosophy, about our dreams and aspirations, about everything and nothing. He was so attentive, hanging on my every word as if I was the most fascinating person he had ever met. He asked thoughtful questions, remembered small details I mentioned in passing, and made me feel seen in a way I had never experienced before. It felt like fate. Like the universe had conspired to bring us together at exactly the right moment. Looking back now with the clarity that only hindsight and trauma can provide, I can see all the red flags that I missed or ignored or rationalized away. The way he immediately wanted to know everything about me, but remained mysteriously vague about his own past. The intensity of his interest that felt flattering, but was actually the beginning of his obsession. The speed at which he wanted our relationship to progress, pushing for exclusivity after just 2 weeks, talking about moving in together after a month, making me feel like I was being cautious and cold if I suggested slowing down. But at the time, I interpreted all of this as passion, as evidence that he loved me deeply and completely. I had never been pursued with such intensity before, and it was intoxicating. He texted me constantly throughout the day, called me every night before bed, wanted to spend every free moment together. My friends joked that I had disappeared into the relationship bubble, and they weren't entirely wrong. I canceled plans, skipped social events, and gradually let my other relationships atrophy because he made me feel like nothing else mattered as long as we were together. The first time he showed his true colors, I explained it away. We had been dating for about 3 months, and I had gone out for drinks with coworkers after work without telling him in advance. When I got home, he was furious, pacing back and forth in my apartment. I had given him a key after just 6 weeks, another decision I would later regret, his face red with anger that he tried to disguise as concern. He said he had been worried sick, that he had called me 20 times and I hadn't answered, that I should have let him know where I was. He made it sound so reasonable, so justified, that I actually felt guilty for not considering his feelings. I apologized profusely, promised to always keep him informed of my whereabouts, and told myself that his reaction came from a place of love and worry. I didn't see it for what it really was, the first step in establishing control. After that, the rules began. They weren't presented as rules, of course. They were suggestions, requests, expressions of his insecurity that he needed me to help him work through. Could I maybe not wear that dress because it was too revealing and made him uncomfortable? Would I mind not going out with my single friends because their lifestyle was a bad influence? Wouldn't it be better if we spent Friday nights together instead of me going to book club? Each request seemed small and reasonable in isolation, but together they were building a cage around me so gradually that I didn't notice the bars until it was too late. By the time we moved in together, his idea, presented as a romantic gesture and a practical solution to save money, he had successfully isolated me from most of my support system. My best friend from college had stopped calling after he made several uncomfortable comments about her dating life. My sister and I were barely speaking because he had convinced me that she was jealous of our relationship and was trying to sabotage it. My parents were concerned but distant, kept at arm's length by my insistence that everything was fine and their interference was making things worse. The first time he hit me was 6 months after we moved in together. I want to say it came out of nowhere, but that wouldn't be entirely true. The verbal abuse had been escalating for weeks, insults disguised as jokes, criticism masked as constructive feedback, constant undermining of my confidence and self-worth. He had begun to control every aspect of my life: what I wore, what I ate, how I spent my money, who I talked to, where I went. But I told myself this was just what committed relationships looked like, that compromise and sacrifice were part of loving someone. The physical violence started over something absurdly trivial. I had bought the wrong brand of orange juice at the grocery store. He exploded with a rage so disproportionate to the offense that I stood frozen in shock as he screamed at me, calling me stupid and worthless and incompetent. Then his hand connected with my face, a sharp crack that echoed in the silence that followed. For a moment, neither of us moved. I raised my hand to my burning cheek, feeling the heat radiating from where he had struck me, and looked at him with a mixture of disbelief and betrayal. And then he started crying. He fell to his knees, sobbing, grabbing my hands and begging for forgiveness. He said he didn't know what had come over him, that he had never done anything like that before, that work stress had pushed him to a breaking point, that he loved me so much it scared him sometimes. He promised it would never happen again, swore on everything he held sacred that he would get help, that he would be better. And I believed him. God help me. I believed him because I wanted to believe him, because the alternative was admitting that I had made a terrible mistake and that the man I loved was actually a danger to me. I told myself it was an isolated incident, that everyone deserves a second chance, that love means standing by someone even when things get difficult. So I stayed, and it happened again, and again, and again, each time followed by tears and apologies and promises that became less convincing with every repetition. The violence escalated gradually, moving from occasional slaps to regular beatings, from spontaneous outbursts to calculated punishments. He developed a terrifying ability to hurt me in ways that wouldn't show, targeting areas that could be hidden by clothing, perfecting the art of inflicting maximum pain while leaving minimal visible evidence. He also refined his psychological torture, alternating between abuse and affection in a pattern so unpredictable that I lived in a constant state of hypervigilance, never knowing which version of him I would encounter. The loving boyfriend who brought me flowers and cooked my favorite meals? Or the monster who screamed at me for hours about imagined offenses before backing me into corners and making me fear for my life? This cycle of violence and reconciliation is what experts call the honeymoon phase of abuse, and it's incredibly effective at keeping victims trapped in dangerous relationships. Living with him became a study in survival, a constant calculation of risks and rewards, a never-ending attempt to predict and prevent the next explosion of violence. I developed hypervigilance that bordered on paranoia, always monitoring his mood, reading his facial expressions for signs of impending rage, adjusting my behavior to try to maintain peace. I became fluent in the language of abuse, understanding that certain tones of voice meant danger, that specific questions were traps designed to justify his anger no matter how I answered, that silence could be just as threatening as screaming. My entire existence revolved around managing his emotions, as if I was responsible for his happiness and therefore deserving of punishment when he was upset. The psychological manipulation was perhaps even more damaging than the physical violence because it attacked my sense of reality itself. He was a master at gaslighting, convincing me that things I clearly remembered had never happened, that my perceptions were distorted, that my feelings were irrational and overblown. When I confronted him about his violence, he would deny it or minimize it or turn it back on me, claiming that I had provoked him, that I was too sensitive, that I was actually the abusive one for making him feel guilty. He would recount events with such confidence and detail that I began to doubt my own memory, wondering if maybe I was crazy, if maybe I was the problem. He isolated me not just physically, but mentally, cutting me off from any external validation or perspective that might contradict his version of reality. He monitored my phone constantly, reading my texts and emails, checking my call history and internet searches. He accused me of infidelity if I so much as smiled at another man, interrogating me for hours about innocent interactions at work or the grocery store. He controlled our finances, giving me an allowance that was barely enough to cover basic necessities and demanding receipts for every purchase. He dictated what I could wear, criticizing anything he deemed too revealing or attractive, slowly replacing my wardrobe with clothes he approved of until I barely recognized myself in the mirror. He even controlled what I ate, commenting constantly on my weight and appearance, alternating between calling me too fat and too thin, ensuring that I was always inadequate, always falling short of his impossible standards. The isolation was total and suffocating. He had successfully convinced me that I had nowhere to go, no one who would believe me, no resources to escape. He reminded me constantly that if I left, he would find me. He described in chilling detail what he would do to me if I ever tried to leave him, painting scenarios so vivid and terrifying that I had nightmares about them. He told me that no one else would ever want me, that I was damaged goods, that I should be grateful he was willing to put up with me despite all my flaws. And after years of this relentless psychological assault, I started to believe him. My self-esteem, once healthy and robust, had been systematically demolished until there was nothing left but a hollow shell of self-loathing and doubt. I looked in the mirror and saw what he told me I was: worthless, stupid, ugly, unlovable. I believed I deserved the abuse because I had internalized his narrative that I was fundamentally flawed and provocative of his violence. This is what sustained abuse does. It doesn't just hurt your body, it colonizes your mind, replacing your thoughts with your abuser's voice until you can't distinguish between his cruelty and your own self-perception. Work became my only escape, the only place where I could pretend to be normal for a few hours each day. I threw myself into my job with desperate intensity, finding solace in spreadsheets and reports and meetings that had nothing to do with my personal hell. My colleagues probably thought I was incredibly dedicated, always arriving early and staying late, volunteering for extra projects and overtime. They didn't know I was actually just delaying going home, stealing a few extra minutes of peace before returning to the war zone of my apartment. But even that sanctuary was compromised because he monitored my work schedule obsessively, timing his pickup so precisely that I had no opportunity to talk privately with anyone who might notice something was wrong. On the rare occasions when a coworker asked if everything was okay, I must not have been hiding my distress as well as I thought. I would plaster on a smile and insist that I was just tired or stressed about a project, deflecting any concern with practiced ease. The shame of my situation was overwhelming. How could I admit to anyone what was happening? How could I explain that I, an intelligent and capable woman, was trapped in an abusive relationship? The societal narrative about domestic violence painted victims as weak and stupid, and I had internalized that judgment so completely that I was paralyzed by the fear of confirming it. I imagined what people would say if they knew. Why doesn't she just leave? I would never let anyone treat me that way. She must like it if she stays. These phantom judgments were sometimes more painful than the actual abuse, because they made me feel complicit in my own victimization, as if I was choosing this nightmare. Have you ever felt so trapped that you couldn't even imagine a way out? That's where I was, existing day to day, moment to moment, just trying to survive until tomorrow. I had stopped making plans for the future because I couldn't see one. I had stopped dreaming about the life I wanted because it seemed impossibly far away. I had stopped being myself because that person had been beaten and belittled and broken down until she no longer existed. All that remained was a survival mechanism dressed in human skin, going through the motions of living while actually just waiting to die. Then came March 15th, the day that would change everything. I woke up that morning with an overwhelming sense of dread that I couldn't shake, a feeling of impending doom that made my hands tremble as I got dressed for work. He was already awake when I emerged from the bedroom, sitting at the kitchen table with a cup of coffee, staring at his phone with an expression I couldn't quite read. The silence in the apartment was oppressive, thick with unspoken tension that made it hard to breathe. I moved carefully around the kitchen, preparing my own coffee with the deliberate slowness of someone trying not to disturb a sleeping predator. Every sound seemed magnified in the quiet: the clink of the spoon against the mug, the gurgle of the coffee maker, the scrape of the chair as I sat down at the opposite end of the table. I could feel his eyes on me, tracking my movements, but when I glanced up, he was still looking at his phone, his jaw clenched in a way that I had learned to recognize as a warning sign. The drive to work was tense and silent. He kept his eyes on the road, but I could feel the anger radiating off him in waves. I ran through my recent actions in my mind, trying to figure out what I had done to upset him, what rule I had broken, what transgression I had committed that warranted this cold fury. I came up empty, which was almost worse because it meant the explosion could be about anything or nothing, that I had no way to predict or prevent what was coming. When we pulled up to my office building, he grabbed my wrist before I could get out of the car. His grip tight enough to hurt, but not quite tight enough to leave a mark. He had perfected that pressure over the years. "Come straight home after work," he said, his voice low and menacing. "Don't talk to anyone. Don't stop anywhere. Straight home." I nodded, not trusting my voice, and he released me with a final squeeze that would leave my wrist aching for hours. I practically ran into the building, my heart pounding, fighting the urge to look back and see if he was still watching. The workday passed in a blur of anxiety and distraction. I couldn't focus on anything, kept making mistakes that I normally wouldn't make, kept jumping every time my phone buzzed with another text from him. The messages started innocuously enough. "Hope you're having a good day, and love you." But by afternoon, they had taken on a more sinister tone. "Can't wait to see you tonight. We need to talk. Things are going to change." Each message sent a spike of adrenaline through my system, my body preparing for danger even though my mind tried to rationalize his words as harmless. At 3 o'clock, my phone rang. It was him, his voice cold and controlled in that way that was somehow more terrifying than when he screamed. He told me he was leaving work early and would be picking me up at 4 instead of 5. My stomach dropped because this meant he had been planning something, had taken steps to ensure we would have extra time alone at home before the evening. I told my supervisor I wasn't feeling well and needed to leave early, not entirely a lie since I felt nauseous with fear, and spent the next hour watching the clock, each minute crawling by with agonizing slowness. When his car pulled up outside at exactly 4 o'clock, I felt like I was walking to my execution. The drive home was silent except for the radio playing some cheerful pop song that felt obscene given the circumstances. He kept both hands on the steering wheel, knuckles white with tension, and I kept my eyes forward, afraid that even glancing at him might trigger whatever was building inside him. When we pulled into the parking lot of our apartment building, he turned off the engine but didn't move to get out. We sat there in silence for what felt like an eternity but was probably only a minute or two. Then he spoke, his voice eerily calm. "I know what you've been doing." My mind raced. What did he think I had been doing? I hadn't talked to anyone, hadn't gone anywhere, hadn't done anything that could possibly be construed as suspicious or disloyal. But I knew from experience that the actual truth didn't matter. He would believe whatever narrative he had constructed in his mind, and any denial on my part would only make things worse. "I don't know what you mean," I said carefully, trying to keep my voice steady and neutral. His hand shot out and grabbed my throat, not squeezing hard enough to cut off my air, but firmly enough to make his point. "Don't lie to me," he hissed, his face inches from mine. "I saw the way you looked at that guy at the coffee shop last week. I saw how you smiled at him. Do you think I'm stupid? Do you think I don't notice when my girlfriend is flirting with other men right in front of me?" I remembered the incident he was referring to. A barista who had made small talk while preparing our order. A completely innocent interaction that I had thought nothing of at the time. But in his distorted perception, my polite friendliness had been transformed into betrayal, into evidence of infidelity, into justification for whatever he had been planning. He released my throat and got out of the car, and I followed because I had no choice, my legs shaking as we walked to the apartment. Once inside, with the door closed behind us, cutting us off from the outside world and any possibility of help, he turned on me with a fury I had never seen before. The beating that followed was savage and sustained, lasting for what felt like hours but was probably closer to 20 or 30 minutes. He used his fists, his feet, anything within reach. He threw me against walls, slammed me into furniture, dragged me across the floor by my hair. He screamed at me the entire time, calling me every degrading name imaginable, accusing me of crimes I hadn't committed, working himself into a rage so intense that I could see he was no longer fully in control of himself. At some point during the assault, something shifted in his eyes, and I realized with absolute clarity that he was going to kill me. This wasn't just another beating that I would survive with bruises and broken bones. This was different. This was him deciding that I no longer deserved to exist, that the only way to solve the problem of my existence was to end it. I saw my death in his eyes, and in that moment, something inside me broke free from the paralysis of fear that had held me captive for so long. When his hands closed around my throat for the second time that day, but with much more force and clear intent, something primal kicked in that overrode all the conditioning and fear that had kept me compliant for years. My survival instinct, that ancient part of the brain that exists solely to keep us alive, took control. I stopped thinking and started fighting. My hands scrabbled against his, trying to pry his fingers from my throat as my vision started to darken around the edges. I couldn't breathe, couldn't scream, couldn't do anything except claw desperately at his hands and wrists, my nails drawing blood that he didn't even seem to notice. His face above mine was contorted with rage and something else, satisfaction maybe, or relief, as if he was finally doing what he had wanted to do for a long time. The pressure on my throat increased, and I could feel consciousness slipping away, that terrible combination of panic and resignation as my body began to shut down from lack of oxygen. But just before everything went black, my right hand, flailing desperately for anything that might help, connected with something on the floor next to us, a heavy glass vase that had fallen during the earlier assault. My fingers closed around it without conscious thought, and with the last of my strength, I swung it upward toward his head. The impact made a sickening sound, a dull thud followed by the crash of breaking glass. His grip on my throat loosened immediately as he reeled backward, and I sucked in a desperate, painful breath of air, coughing and gasping. He was still conscious but stunned, blood streaming from a gash on his temple where the vase had connected. For a moment, we both just stared at each other, equally shocked by what had just happened. I had never fought back before, had never dared to defend myself physically, and the look on his face suggested he was as surprised as I was. But I knew this momentary advantage wouldn't last long. I could see the rage rebuilding in his eyes, could see him gathering himself to come at me again, and this time he wouldn't make the mistake of giving me any opportunity to fight back. This time he would make sure I didn't survive. So I ran. With blood pounding in my ears and my throat burning from where he had choked me, I scrambled to my feet and ran for the door. My hands fumbled with the locks. Why had we installed so many locks, I thought hysterically, but I could hear him behind me getting up, coming after me. Finally, the door burst open, and I was in the hallway, screaming for help, running toward the stairs because the elevator would be too slow. I could hear him behind me, his footsteps pounding on the floor, his voice shouting my name, but I didn't look back. Looking back would slow me down, and slowing down meant death. I burst out of the stairwell into the lobby, where our elderly neighbor Mrs. Chen was checking her mailbox. She took one look at me, bruised, bleeding, hysterical, and immediately pulled out her phone to call 911. Her husband, Mr. Chen, stepped between me and the stairwell door just as it burst open with my abuser right behind me. Mr. Chen was a small man, probably in his 70s, but he stood his ground with more courage than I had shown in 2 years of abuse. "You stay away from her," he said firmly, and somehow his presence and Mrs. Chen frantically talking to the police on her phone made my abuser stop. He stood there in the doorway, breathing hard, looking between the three of us, and I could see him calculating whether he could get to me before help arrived. The wail of sirens in the distance made his decision for him. He looked at me with such hatred that I actually took a step backward despite Mr. Chen's protective presence. "This isn't over," he said, his voice cold and level. "You're mine. You'll always be mine. And if I can't have you, no one will." Then he turned and ran back into the stairwell, presumably to our apartment to grab his things before the police arrived. But he didn't make it out of the building. The police responding to Mrs. Chen's 911 call caught him trying to leave through a back entrance. The paramedics arrived moments later, and I remember sitting in the back of the ambulance with a blanket wrapped around my shoulders, watching police officers escort him out of the building in handcuffs. He locked eyes with me as they put him in the police car, and the malevolence in that look made it clear that his threat hadn't been empty. Even arrested, even facing serious criminal charges, he was still trying to control me through fear. The hospital was a blur of examinations, photographs of my injuries, and gentle questions from a nurse who specialized in assault cases. The physical damage was extensive: bruised and swollen throat, multiple contusions on my face and body, cracked ribs, a minor concussion. But the psychological trauma was far worse than any physical injury. I kept reliving those final moments when his hands were around my throat, kept seeing the determination in his eyes to end my life, kept feeling the terror of knowing I was going to die. The nurse gave me information about domestic violence resources, numbers to call, shelters that could keep me safe. A police detective came to take my statement, carefully walking me through the events of the day and the history of abuse that preceded it. For the first time, I told the truth about what had been happening behind closed doors for the past 2 years. Speaking the words out loud, admitting the full scope of what I had endured, was both liberating and devastating. Each detail I shared felt like I was pulling back layers of shame and secrecy that had been suffocating me, But it also meant confronting the reality of how bad things had gotten, how close I had come to becoming a statistic, another woman killed by her intimate partner. The days and weeks following that terrible afternoon were simultaneously the most terrifying and most empowering of my life. I couldn't go back to the apartment. It was now a crime scene. And even if it wasn't, I couldn't bear the thought of returning to the place where I had almost died. The domestic violence shelter that took me in became my haven, a place where I was surrounded by women who understood my fear and my trauma because they had lived it themselves. For the first time in years, I wasn't alone with my pain. I was in a community of survivors who didn't judge me for staying as long as I did, who didn't question why I hadn't fought back sooner, who simply supported me as I began the long and difficult process of rebuilding my life. The shelter was a revelation in so many ways. I had expected it to be a sad, depressing place, but instead I found strength and resilience in those walls. The women there, from all walks of life and all backgrounds, shared their stories in group therapy sessions that were both heartbreaking and inspiring. I heard from women who had endured decades of abuse, women who had lost everything to escape, women who were fighting for custody of their children against abusive partners who used the legal system as another tool of control. I realized that my experience, while uniquely my own, was also tragically common. Intimate partner violence doesn't discriminate. It affects women regardless of education, economic status, race, or age. The myth that only certain types of women end up in abusive relationships was shattered as I met doctors, lawyers, teachers, and stay-at-home mothers who all shared variations of the same story, a relationship that started with love and promise but slowly transformed into a nightmare of control and violence. The shelter's counselors helped me understand the dynamics of abuse in ways I had never considered before. They explained the cycle of violence, the psychological mechanisms that keep victims trapped, the tactics abusers use to maintain power and control. Learning this framework for understanding my experience was incredibly validating because it confirmed that what happened to me wasn't random or unique, but rather followed predictable patterns that researchers and advocates had been documenting for decades. It meant I wasn't crazy, wasn't weak, wasn't somehow uniquely broken or damaged. I was simply the victim of a systematic process of manipulation and violence that millions of women experience every year. But knowledge alone wasn't enough to heal me. I had nightmares every night, vivid and terrifying dreams where he found me, where his hands were around my throat again, where I couldn't escape no matter how fast I ran. I was hypervigilant constantly, jumping at every sound, convinced that he would somehow find me despite the shelter's confidential location and security measures. The rational part of my brain knew he was in jail awaiting trial, that there was a restraining order in place, that I was safer than I had been in years. But trauma doesn't respond to logic. My nervous system was stuck in a constant state of high alert, unable to distinguish between past danger and present safety. The legal process was another challenge entirely. The district attorney assigned to my case was sympathetic and supportive, but she was also realistic about what we were facing. Building a strong case against my abuser would require me to testify in detail about the abuse I had suffered, to recount the most traumatic and humiliating experiences of my life in front of a courtroom full of strangers. She warned me that his defense attorney would likely try to discredit me, to paint me as a liar or an instigator, to suggest that I had somehow provoked or deserved the violence. The justice system, she explained with obvious frustration, was still not particularly kind to victims of domestic violence. But despite these warnings, I knew I had to press charges, not just for myself, but for every woman he might hurt in the future if I didn't stop him now. The detective investigating my case had discovered that I wasn't his first victim. There were 2 previous girlfriends who had filed police reports against him for domestic violence, though neither case had gone to trial. One woman had dropped the charges after he promised to get help, and she foolishly believed him. The other had moved out of state to escape him, leaving her case unresolved. Learning about these other women filled me with a complicated mixture of emotions. On one hand, it was validating to know that his violence wasn't something I had uniquely provoked, that this was a pattern of behavior that predated me. On the other hand, I felt crushing guilt that maybe if those earlier cases had been prosecuted, I might have been spared my own ordeal. This guilt was irrational. I wasn't responsible for the failure of the justice system to hold him accountable earlier, but it haunted me nonetheless. So I made the decision to see the case through, no matter how difficult it would be. I met with the prosecutor multiple times to prepare for trial, reviewing my medical records and the photographs of my injuries, going over the timeline of the abuse and the events of that final day. Each meeting was emotionally exhausting, requiring me to relive trauma that I was trying desperately to move past. But I forced myself to keep showing up because I understood that my testimony might be the difference between justice and impunity. Finding my voice after years of being silenced was a gradual and often painful process. The shelter's therapy program was instrumental in helping me begin to reclaim my sense of self. My therapist, a kind woman named Dr. Martinez who specialized in trauma recovery, helped me understand that healing wasn't linear, that I would have good days and bad days, that progress would sometimes feel like 2 steps forward and 1 step back. She validated my rage, my grief, my confusion, and my fear, creating a space where I could express emotions that I had suppressed for so long that I had almost forgotten how to feel them. One of the most powerful exercises Dr. Martinez had me do was writing letters that I would never send. To him, to my younger self, to the people I felt had failed me. These letters became a way to process and release emotions that I had been carrying around like weights. Writing to him, I expressed all the anger and betrayal I felt, all the questions I wanted answered, all the accusations I would never get to say to his face. Writing to my younger self, the woman who had fallen for his charm 3 years ago, I offered the compassion and understanding I hadn't been able to give myself. I told her that it wasn't her fault, that she couldn't have known, that she deserved love and respect and safety. Writing to others, family members who had distanced themselves, friends who had stopped calling, even the justice system that had failed his previous victims, I explored my feelings about complicity and responsibility and the many ways that society enables domestic violence through silence and inaction. But perhaps the most important work I did in therapy was learning to rebuild my sense of self-worth. Dr. Martinez explained that abuse works by systematically destroying a victim's confidence and self-esteem, replacing it with the abuser's narrative of worthlessness and inadequacy. Recovering meant challenging that false narrative and reconnecting with my authentic self. This was incredibly difficult work, because his voice had become so deeply embedded in my thoughts that I struggled to distinguish between what I actually believed about myself and what he had conditioned me to believe. We worked on identifying negative self-talk and tracing it back to his abuse, then replacing it with more realistic and compassionate self-assessments. Slowly, painfully, I began to remember who I was before him, to reconnect with interests and passions I had abandoned, to imagine a future that wasn't defined by survival, but by possibility. I also had to rebuild my support system, reaching out to family and friends I had pushed away during the years of abuse. These conversations were difficult because they required me to be vulnerable, to admit that I had been wrong, to isolate myself, to ask for forgiveness and understanding. Some people were immediately supportive, wrapping me in love and acceptance without judgment. My sister cried when I finally told her the truth about what I had been enduring, apologizing for not pushing harder when she suspected something was wrong, promising to be there for me through the recovery process. My parents were heartbroken but relieved that I was finally safe, offering both emotional and financial support as I worked to rebuild my life. But not everyone was understanding. Some friends couldn't or wouldn't move past the hurt they felt from my years of distance and avoidance. Some people, even well-meaning ones, asked questions that revealed their lack of understanding about domestic violence. Why didn't you just leave? Couldn't you tell he was abusive when you met him? Did you do something to make him so angry? These questions, though usually asked out of ignorance rather than malice, were incredibly painful because they reinforced the shame and self-blame I was working so hard to overcome. I learned to set boundaries with people who couldn't offer the kind of support I needed, even if that meant accepting that some relationships had been permanently damaged. At work, I had to decide how much to disclose about what had happened. I had taken a leave of absence immediately after the assault, using the time to focus on therapy and legal proceedings. But eventually I had to return. I was terrified about facing my colleagues, worried about their judgment and pity. But my supervisor, when I finally told her the truth about why I had been so distracted and anxious in the months leading up to the assault, was nothing but supportive. She connected me with the company's employee assistance program, assured me that my job was secure, and even testified on my behalf about the change in my demeanor and performance during the time I was being abused. Her validation meant more to me than she probably realized, because it confirmed that the abuse had been visible to others, that I hadn't been as successful at hiding it as I thought. As the trial date approached, my anxiety intensified. I would have to face him in court, would have to sit just feet away from the man who had tried to kill me while he stared at me with those cold, calculating eyes. The prosecutor prepared me for what to expect, but no amount of preparation could fully ready me for the reality of seeing him again. When the day finally came, I walked into that courthouse with my sister on one side and my victim advocate on the other, drawing strength from their presence. The trial lasted 3 days. 3 of the longest and most emotionally brutal days of my life. Taking the stand to testify was terrifying. I had to speak in detail about the most intimate and humiliating experiences of my life while he sat there watching me, while his attorney tried to twist my words and paint me as a vindictive liar. But I refused to be silenced anymore. I told my truth clearly and completely, describing the escalating pattern of abuse, the isolation and control, and finally, the attempted murder. I showed the jury the photographs of my injuries, the medical reports documenting the damage he had done, the police reports from that day. Have you ever had to prove that your pain was real? That your trauma was valid? It's a uniquely degrading experience, but I endured it because I knew what was at stake. The trial became a surreal experience of watching my private hell being dissected and debated in a public forum. His defense attorney tried every trick in the book to discredit me and minimize his client's actions. She suggested I had exaggerated the abuse, that the injuries from the final assault were the result of a mutual altercation, where I had been the aggressor. She brought up my lack of previous police reports as evidence that the abuse couldn't have been as bad as I claimed, conveniently ignoring the well-documented phenomenon of underreporting in domestic violence cases. She tried to paint me as vindictive and unstable, suggesting my accusations were motivated by revenge after a bad breakup. She even had the audacity to suggest that I had somehow enjoyed the abuse, pointing to the fact that I had stayed in the relationship for 2 years as proof that it couldn't have been that terrible. Each of these tactics made me feel violated all over again, as if I was being abused in a different way by a legal system that seemed designed to protect the perpetrator rather than the victim. But the prosecutor was prepared for these tactics and systematically dismantled each one. She brought in medical experts who testified about the severity and age of my injuries, confirming that the pattern of bruising indicated sustained abuse over a long period. She presented testimony from the previous girlfriends who had filed reports against him, establishing a clear pattern of violent behavior. She had Mrs. Chen testify about what she had witnessed that day in the lobby, describing my terror and his pursuit. She introduced phone records showing his obsessive monitoring of my communications and whereabouts. She had my therapist testify about my symptoms of trauma and the ways abuse victims are psychologically conditioned to stay in dangerous relationships. Piece by piece, she built a comprehensive picture of systematic abuse that culminated in attempted murder. The most powerful moment of the trial came when the prosecutor played the 911 call Mrs. Chen had made that day. Hearing her panicked voice describing the scene, hearing my own screams in the background, seeing the jury's faces as they listened, that was when I knew we had won. You could see the shift in their expressions, the moment when any doubt they might have had evaporated, and they understood the reality of what he had done. When his turn came to testify, he tried to present himself as the real victim, claiming that I had been the controlling and abusive one, that he had only been defending himself that day when I attacked him with the vase. His testimony was smooth and practiced, delivered with just the right amount of emotion to seem genuine without appearing manipulative. For a moment, I felt a flash of the old fear, worried that his charm and lies might actually work, that the jury might believe his version of events over mine. But then the prosecutor began her cross-examination, and I watched his facade crack. She asked him about the previous girlfriends who had accused him of abuse. She confronted him with the medical evidence showing that my injuries were far more severe than his. She questioned him about the texts he had sent me that day, the ones where he had written, "Things are going to change and this isn't over." She asked him to explain why, if I was the aggressor, he had fled the scene and tried to leave the building when police arrived. With each question, his story became less coherent, his anger harder to control. Finally, he lost his composure entirely, snapping at the prosecutor in a way that gave the jury a glimpse of the rage I had lived with for 2 years. That moment, more than anything else, sealed his fate. The jury deliberated for less than 4 hours before returning with a guilty verdict on all counts: attempted murder, aggravated assault, and criminal threatening. When the verdict was read, I felt my knees go weak with relief. My sister grabbed my hand and squeezed it so hard it hurt, but I barely noticed because I was crying too hard to see clearly. He was convicted. He would go to prison. I was finally, truly safe. The sentencing hearing 2 weeks later gave me one more opportunity to address him directly through my victim impact statement. Standing at that podium, looking at him sitting at the defense table with his hands cuffed, I told him exactly what his abuse had taken from me and exactly how I was taking my life back. I told him about the nightmares, the anxiety, the years of therapy I would need to heal from what he had done. I told him about the strength I had found in surviving his attempt to destroy me. And I told him that he no longer had any power over me, that his threats and his violence had failed to break me, that I would live a full and happy life despite his best efforts to prevent it. He wouldn't look at me as I spoke, keeping his eyes fixed on the table in front of him, but I didn't need him to look at me. I was speaking for myself, not for him. The judge sentenced him to 15 years in prison with no possibility of parole for at least 10 years. It wasn't enough. No sentence could undo the trauma or give me back the years I had lost. But it was something. It was justice. Imperfect and incomplete, but real nonetheless. As they led him out of the courtroom in shackles, I felt a weight lift from my chest that I had been carrying for so long I had forgotten what it felt like to breathe freely. Rising from the ashes of that experience has been the hardest work of my life, but also the most rewarding. The months following the trial were a strange mixture of relief and difficulty as I worked to build a new life from scratch. I had to find a new apartment, one where he had never been, where I could feel safe. I had to slowly rebuild my confidence in my own judgment, learning to trust myself again after years of being told that my perceptions were wrong. I had to rediscover who I was outside of the context of abuse, reconnecting with interests and passions that I had abandoned. It wasn't a linear process. There were setbacks and struggles, days when the trauma felt overwhelming and the future seemed impossibly difficult. But with each small victory, each milestone of healing, I felt myself becoming stronger and more whole. One of the most transformative parts of my recovery was connecting with other survivors and eventually beginning to advocate for changes in how domestic violence is addressed in our community. I started volunteering at the shelter that had taken me in, helping other women navigate the terrifying early days of leaving an abusive relationship. I shared my story at awareness events, speaking publicly about domestic violence in hopes that my experience might help someone else recognize the signs of abuse before it was too late. I worked with local legislators to support stronger domestic violence laws and better funding for victim services. This advocacy work became a way to transform my pain into purpose, to ensure that my suffering hadn't been meaningless. If my story could save even one woman from experiencing what I went through, then maybe all of it had been worth it. I also worked on forgiveness, though not in the way people often expect. I didn't forgive him for what he did. That would minimize the seriousness of his crimes and let him off the hook for his choices. But I worked on forgiving myself for staying, for not leaving sooner, for all the ways I blamed myself for the abuse. Dr. Martinez helped me understand that self-forgiveness was essential for healing, that I couldn't move forward while still carrying the burden of misplaced guilt. I practiced self-compassion, treating myself with the same kindness and understanding I would offer a friend in the same situation. Slowly, I released the shame that had kept me silent for so long, accepting that I was not responsible for his violence, that I had done the best I could with the information and resources I had at the time. Rebuilding my sense of safety took time and conscious effort. I installed extra locks on my apartment door and a security system that would alert me if anyone tried to enter. I took self-defense classes to feel more empowered physically. I learned meditation and grounding techniques to manage my anxiety and hypervigilance. I adopted a dog, a sweet rescue named Luna, who became both my companion and my protector, her presence in my apartment making me feel less alone and vulnerable. These might seem like small things, but each one contributed to my gradual recovery of a sense of security in my own life. I also had to learn how to be in a relationship again, though that took years of work before I was ready. The idea of trusting someone with my heart after what I had been through was terrifying. What if I made the same mistake again? What if I missed the warning signs? What if I let someone hurt me again? Dr. Martinez helped me understand that not all men are abusers, that it was possible to find healthy love, but that I needed to do the work first to understand what had made me vulnerable to that particular relationship. I learned about attachment styles and trauma bonding. I learned to identify red flags early. I learned to trust my instincts and set firm boundaries. And eventually, when I did begin dating again, I approached it with a wisdom and self-awareness that I hadn't possessed before. The relationships I built in my new life were fundamentally different from what I had experienced with him, based on mutual respect, honest communication, and genuine care for each other's well-being. Today, 5 years after that terrible March afternoon when I nearly died, I am living a life I couldn't have imagined during those dark years of abuse. I have a career I'm passionate about, working as an advocate for domestic violence survivors. I have strong, healthy relationships with family and friends who support and value me. I have a home where I feel safe and peaceful. I have learned to love myself in ways I never did before, to value my own worth, to speak my truth without fear. The nightmares have become less frequent. The hypervigilance has diminished. And while I still carry the scars, both visible and invisible, I no longer let them define me. I am more than what was done to me. I am a survivor, yes, but I am also a thriver. Someone who took the worst experience of her life and used it as fuel to become stronger and more purposeful. So let me tell you why I'm sharing this story with you today. Why I'm opening up about the most painful and private experience of my life. Because somewhere out there, someone is reading this or watching this who is living in that same hell I escaped from. Someone is making excuses for their partner's behavior, minimizing the abuse, believing they can fix things if they just try harder. Someone is feeling trapped and hopeless, convinced that there's no way out, that they somehow deserve the treatment they're receiving. Someone is planning to leave but is terrified of what will happen if they try. And I want that person to know, you are not alone, you are not crazy, and you do not deserve to be abused. Nothing you did caused this, and nothing you can do will fix your abuser. Only they can make the choice to change, and most abusers never do. But you can make a choice. You can choose to survive. You can choose to leave. You can choose to build a different life, even though it seems impossible right now. It won't be easy. Leaving an abusive relationship is often the most dangerous time, and the road to recovery is long and difficult. But it is possible, and you are worth it. There are resources available to help you. The National Domestic Violence Hotline is available 24 hours a day at 1-800-799-7233. Local shelters can provide safe housing and support services. Therapists who specialize in trauma can help you heal. Legal advocates can guide you through the justice system. You don't have to do this alone. Please, if you're in an abusive relationship, reach out for help. Talk to someone you trust. Call a hotline. Make a safety plan. Document the abuse. And when you're ready, leave and don't look back. Your life is worth fighting for. Your future is worth protecting. You deserve safety and love and respect, and you can have those things, but only if you survive long enough to claim them. I live to tell my story, and I'm using my voice to help others find theirs. Have you or someone you know experienced domestic violence? Share your thoughts or your own story in the comments below. Your words might be exactly what someone else needs to hear to find the courage to leave. If this story touched your heart or opened your eyes to the reality of intimate partner violence, please leave a like to help spread awareness. And if you want to hear more stories of survival and resilience, more content that sheds light on important issues and celebrates the strength of the human spirit, please subscribe to I Live to Tell and hit that notification bell so you never miss a new video. Together, we can break the silence around domestic violence. Together, we can create a world where no one has to live in fear. Together, we can ensure that every victim becomes a survivor, and every survivor finds the support they need to heal. Thank you for listening to my story, for bearing witness to my pain and my triumph. Thank you for caring enough to watch until the end. And if you're that person I mentioned earlier, the one who needed to hear this message today, thank you for still being here, for not giving up, for considering that there might be another way. You are stronger than you know, and you deserve so much better than what you're experiencing. Please choose to survive. Choose to live to tell your own story. I promise you it gets better. The life waiting for you on the other side of abuse is worth every difficult step it takes to get there. Stay strong, stay safe, and never forget that you matter.